Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in the month of January 2025, and there were some really good ones on this list. So there were 25 books in total, and let me go ahead and get started. I'm just going to pull up my list here. All right, so the first book that I picked up in the month of January was one called The Last Hunt by Audrey Cole. And this is the second book in a series where, I think the final book, I think it's only 2 books total, where the first book is basically about this woman who discovers that her husband, who just died, is a serial killer. And then she realizes that he may have faked his own death. And it's kind of hard to talk about the second book in the series without giving away things that happened in the first book in the series. But I will just say that the second book continues on basically from the ending of the first book. So these would be great to read back to back. And I really enjoyed kind of the development of the female character in this. I mean, I think she's obviously learning a lot about this situation with her husband and having to kind of come to terms with her relationship with him when she did not know this about him. She had like no glimpse of this whatsoever. And then she finds out, you know, this kind of horrible thing about him and is trying to kind of reconcile that with her other memories of him over time as well. The next book that I picked up is called Disappearing Earth by Julia Phillips. This is definitely literary fiction. It tells the story of 2 young girls who go missing in Russia. And the story is basically chapters from the perspectives of a bunch of different women. And so it's a little bit like disconnected and connected at the same time. That's kind of what I mean by it's definitely literary fiction. It's not something that is really like plot driven and not even really character driven because of how it's a little bit kind of disconnected with all these different viewpoints, but it's beautifully written. And I think it is kind of a slower read. It's one that you can really kind of just like sink into because it's certainly not fast paced. But I really did enjoy that one. It's been one I've wanted to pick up for a while, so I'm glad I looked at that one. Then I read basically back to back the first 3 books in Catherine Cowell's Sutter Lake series. They are called, the first book is Beautifully Broken Pieces. The second book is called Beautifully Broken Life. And the third book is called Beautifully Broken Spirit. And these were 3 books that I got in like an audiobook box set. So I basically just listened to them back to back. Relatively short in terms of just time, you know, to devote to them. And Catherine Cowell's definitely writes like small town romance. This set of books also had a little bit of like romance suspense looped in with them as well. I will say that I wasn't like completely blown away by reading these. I mean, I enjoyed them, but there's some other later books that Catherine Cowell has done that I enjoy more. So I see her kind of developing as an author over time. I think this is more from her backlist. And so maybe start with her more recent stuff. Then I picked up as one of my Alphabet Challenge books for the month, a book called Money Zen, The Secret to Finding Your Enough by Manisha Thakor. And one of the things that I appreciated about this author's lens when thinking about finance was basically like, don't just try to create more money for the sake of creating more money. And really thinking about kind of what is your enough? What are the things that you really care about and that are meaningful to you? What are your values around money? And whenever you can get into kind of like a deeper perspective on like money mindset, I always appreciate that. And so this was just a book that I found interesting and I appreciated her lens. Then I picked up Jane McGonigal's Super Better, and this is a book that talks about gamification and how it ties in with things like resiliency, which I am fascinated by. And Jane McGonigal actually describes her own situation of having like a brain injury and how she utilized gamification to kind of come back from some really challenging like mental health situations that she was encountering because of this injury. And it's a really interactive book. This is one of the cool things I think about what she's done, you know, with this book, and she's done it with some of her other books as well. There are a lot of activities, there are a lot of like practical things you can immediately implement into your life that help it to be just like highly practical. And you can just kind of like try it out and see if it works for you, which I think is a really cool component of it. All right, then I picked up Brad Stulberg's book, Master of Change. And this is a book where he talks about something called rugged flexibility, which is a term that he made up and talks about in this book. One of my absolute favorite things about this book was a deep dive into talking about values. So kind of similar back to the concept of the Money Zen book, he goes deeply into your resiliency is kind of dependent on your knowledge of yourself and like what really matters to you. And so the chapters that kind of did a deep dive on values and how you can utilize your values to basically like stabilize yourself in times of change, I loved that. And this is something that I utilize a lot in my coaching practice and working with clients is how do you identify your values and then leverage them in those kinds of ways? So that was definitely my favorite part of that book. Then I picked up, as part of my NetGalley kind of challenge to myself, I'm trying to read more advanced readers copies from that platform. I picked up a book called Now It All Makes Sense by Alex Partridge. And this is a story about how the author was kind of a late stage diagnosis for ADHD. And it explains a lot about his kind of life experience. He has, some very high highs and that he runs like a multi-million-dollar company. And he also has some very low lows, like he ends up in jail at one point. And the part about this book that I probably appreciated the most, and I would say it's like maybe the last third of the book, is he gets into very practical suggestions and kind of tactics for people with ADHD in terms of like, how do you run a business and how do you have a good relationship? And, he talks about, I think even having like ADHD and having kids and like, what are all the practical things that you can kind of think about? And I think with these narratives that are kind of more memoir based, it's also really helpful to share the things that have worked directly for that person, knowing that it's not going to work necessarily the same for everyone else, but just kind of like in their own experience, these are the kinds of things that they would recommend. And that was the part of the book that I enjoyed the most. All right, then I picked up Elena Armas's The Fiancé Dilemma. This is her second book in the Green Oak series. And what is kind of interesting about this series, it's very like quirky small town. Think like Gilmore Girls. Like if that's the kind of vibe that you're interested in, you would probably like this series. It's meant to be, I think, like romantic comedy. It's kind of light and funny. In this particular story, it's basically about a man and a woman who kind of fake being engaged because of this like convoluted situation that the female main character finds herself in. I did find earlier books by Elena Armas a little bit more compelling. She has a book called The Spanish Love Deception, which was the first book I read by her, and I really enjoyed that. And then I think another book called The American Roommate Experiment, and then she started this like entirely different series. So I enjoy the books, but I would say they're just a very different vibe from some of the earlier stuff that she wrote. And I would definitely keep reading her just to kind of see the arc of what she's publishing and where she's going. Okay, then I picked up a book called They Never Learn by Lane Fargo. And this is a book that I believe is by the same author who wrote The Favorites, which I didn't realize this until very recently. And The Favorites is like a book that everyone is talking about right now. I have not yet read it. I have it on my like lone pile of things I'm trying to get from my library, my reserve file. But this particular book is like an earlier one that she wrote, and it is about a college professor who is a serial killer, and she is targeting men on the campus who are basically like sexual predators. And the book goes back and forth in time. There's kind of an earlier storyline and then a later storyline. I think I probably read this in just a couple of sittings. Like it was very compelling. I'm trying to remember, I listened to it on audio, but I also had it on ebook. So I was kind of jumping back and forth. And I would definitely read more by this author. And when I found out that she had written The Favorites, I was like even more intrigued because that one I think is more of like a toxic romance of some kind. And so I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I hope to pick up that one soon, but would definitely recommend this one as well. Also in the month of January, I read the 3-book trilogy, the Mad Adam trilogy by Margaret Atwood. This starts with Oryx and Crake, and then the second book in the trilogy is The Year of the Flood, and then the third book in the trilogy is called Mad Adam. I think that Margaret Atwood is a genius. You cannot convince me otherwise. I think that her books are incredibly sophisticated. I think she brings in all kinds of themes that just blend together in some really fascinating ways. This particular trilogy is about kind of like genetics, bioengineering. It talks about environmentalism and sustainability. There are dynamics of like different relationships. There's a religious component, like a sub-theme in book 2, and it continues into book 3. And I will say the books are dense, and they're a little bit slow going because of that dense factor. Like you're really having to kind of like pay attention. I did listen to these on audio, but I was reading them in physical copy as well, just to kind of make sure I was following along with what was going on. And even then, I mean, because they're kind of structured in a really interesting way, where the first book you follow a couple of characters, and basically I will say the whole trilogy is about a plague, and you kind of learn the origin of the plague in book 1. And then in book 2, you kind of switch over to another set of characters that are loosely connected to the characters in the first book, and then the third book kind of continues on. So you're kind of jumping around a little bit in all 3 of the books, and seeing things from many different perspectives. And so you do have to really like settle in and kind of pay attention. But I would definitely read more Margaret Atwood in the future. I feel like I really need to dig into her backlist because I have really appreciated everything she's done. Okay, the next book I picked up is called Matrix by Lauren Groff. I feel like a lot of the books I read this month were kind of like very literary fiction type books. This falls into that category as well. A little bit shorter, but basically about a woman who moves to an abbey and is living with a bunch of other nuns, becomes a nun, and it's basically the story of her life, and it kind of unfolds over a period of time. This is one of those books that, similar to some of the other ones I've talked about, you kind of have to just like settle in and pay attention and just enjoy it. It's not super plot heavy. It's more character driven. I mean, I would say that, especially the main character. But this is one of those books that if you're looking for something that's kind of like a more, I don't know, like a deeper kind of escape, it really does take you to another time and place. It takes place in the 1500s. And I think Lauren Groff is really experimental in the different kinds of books that she writes. They're all a little bit different. And everything that she's done, I've really enjoyed. So I would recommend this one as well. Then I picked up a book called The Berry Pickers by Amanda Peters. This is a book that I'd heard about from a number of different people who said they really enjoyed it. Another literary fiction, kind of a bit of a mystery as well. It's about a young girl who is kidnapped or basically disappears, and the story of what happens to her basically, and to her family that gets left behind. And it was very literary fiction-y, as is the theme this month. But I would say this book was a little bit also more like lyrical in terms of some of the descriptions. There's a tie to kind of like the land and the environment of like where this happens. I believe it's set in Maine, if I'm remembering correctly. And so you get kind of some of that pulled in as well in terms of some dynamics between her, and you also hear from her brother, who comes up as a character kind of later in the book as well. So I would recommend that one. I feel like the theme for a lot of the books I read this month is like, you really want to like take your time to enjoy them. Like, these are not kind of like fast-paced thrillers. You know, I had a lot of books this month that I really was able to just kind of like sink in and enjoy, which was perfect for January. Okay, next up I read a book called Solitude by Robert Kull. This is a memoir of a man who decides to live by himself in complete solitude for a year. He packs up a bunch of his stuff, he brings his cat, and he moves to this like island basically. And he's so dedicated to this particular mission that even at one point he has like dental issues. This reminded me a lot of like the Castaway film. And he like knocks out his own tooth. I mean, like he is unwilling to like leave this solitude. And he's actually doing it as a kind of study, and he turns it into a dissertation, which I was not really understanding that was the direction it was going. But then it went in that direction, and I was like, oh, okay, this is like really interesting. And so it's basically his diary of like day to day what's happening. So it's nature writing, if that's something that's of interest to you. I will say that I wasn't like fascinated in like turning the pages. I mean, I was intrigued by the concept of this and like what this man was doing, just because it was so kind of odd, you know, to go off and do this, especially in kind of like modern day. It's rare that you would have that like complete sense of solitude. But interesting angle that he took there. Then I picked up a book by Devney Perry called The Coppersmith Farmhouse. This is the first book in her Jameson Valley series. Devney Perry has a deep backlist that I continue to work my way through. And in this particular series, or in this book that starts off the series, there is a woman who inherits a house from a man that she's been caring for, an elderly man. And she moves to this town, and shocking turn of events, she meets a sheriff and they have a romance. Now, if you've heard me talk in previous videos about Devney Perry before, I always joke that many of her books have a sheriff, a male main character who's a sheriff, and this is part of the romance. And so there's definitely like this subgenre of books that has like a law enforcement character, you know, getting involved in a romance. And I would say that I enjoyed this. It wasn't maybe one of my favorites. I tend to like her romance suspense. This had a little bit of that, but I would say it was more kind of like a straight up romance in this particular book. Then I picked up a couple of nonfiction books. The first one is called HBR at 100. This is a bunch of essays from Harvard Business Review after they were basically publishing for 100 years. And if you've not read Harvard Business Review, these are typically kind of a mix of science and research with people's kind of lived experience of like leadership and business. And I tend to read HBRs. They have these like collections of like 10 essays around a theme, and I've picked up many of those over the years. And so there were actually several essays in this book that I already read because I picked it up, you know, in some other fashion. But I really appreciate the curation of this particular collection. If you're unfamiliar with Harvard Business Review, this would be a great place to start. Then I picked up a book by T.J. English called Where the Bodies Were Buried. This is a kind of description and narrative of Whitey Bulger, who, if you are unfamiliar with this person, he was basically a mob boss in the East Coast, Boston area. And he had kind of this interesting twist to his story in that he was an FBI informant. And this came up kind of during his trial, basically. And I think it was almost used as like a defense for some of the things that he did. And this author really kind of like digs into this concept of using criminals basically as informants and giving them immunity, and like what are some of the challenges of that, and especially in getting justice for families. I didn't know very much about Whitey Bulger at all. And so I will say this book is very detailed. I mean, this person is kind of coming at it from like a journalist perspective. And so there's a lot of like names, dates, places, events. He attended the trial. He's looking at the transcripts. Like there's heavy amounts of detail. I will say, I don't feel like I followed absolutely every strand of what he was saying, but I probably got about 80% of like who all these people were and how they were all connected. Because it's a pretty big web of criminal activity basically that he's describing. But I'm glad I read it because this is just an area and a person that I didn't know very much about. And now I feel like I have a kind of high level sense of what was going on. All right, then I picked up Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. This was part of my alphabet challenge because I originally pulled the letter Z. I only had one Z book, so then I had to switch to M books. But I picked up this one, and I'm kind of sorry to say, this is by Robert Pirsig. I found this book to be just incredibly boring. It's probably one of the most boring books I've ever read. And some of you may have read this book and just absolutely loved it. And if that's the case, I'm kind of sorry that I feel this way. But it's a combination of, as the title implies, motorcycles and information about motorcycles, philosophy, and there's basically a character who like lectures on philosophy, and so that comes into the book. The story of a father and son who are on like a journey together, and their experiences camping and staying in hotels. And it's not autobiographical. It's like loosely based on this author and his son. And so it's almost like fictional, like creative nonfiction, like you might think about it in that category. And some people have said this book like changed their life. And I'm so happy for them that that was the case. But when I read this, I was just like, I am just like not connecting with any of this information. It's not interesting to me. Maybe that says more about me than the book, that I don't like motorcycles or philosophy or father-son narratives. I don't know. Maybe it's just the combination of all of them. Actually, I found many father-son narratives that I have enjoyed. But I don't know that I can recommend this one. It was tough for me. But if you like any of those four things, camping, father-son narratives, motorcycles, or philosophy, definitely pick this one up. Okay, then I switched to a book that I found significantly more engaging, and that is Kiera Cass's 1,000 Heartbeats. This is a, I think, YA novel. She's also well known for a YA series called The Selection, which is basically a YA series that's based off of like The Bachelor, and it's set in a castle. And I read that and just completely, gobbled it down. I mean, I read it book after book and just really enjoyed it. This particular book is a standalone, and it's kind of an enemies to lovers about a girl and a male main character and a female main character who basically live in separate parts of this made up world, and they're fighting against each other. Like they're where they live, like they each live in kind of these separate kingdoms, and they're basically at war. And because of that, they each have a parent that was basically like killed by the other side. And so they have like this just deep hatred, for this other side. and yet they keep coming together, and it's almost like a star-crossed lovers, kind of plot as well. And there's a wonderful scene, maybe like halfway in, 40% in, where they get kind of stuck together, and you see them kind of like figuring out how to engage with each other. And I really liked it. I think I read this in 2 sittings. It's long. I want to say it's like 400 pages, maybe more. But I was just like turning the pages. I really, really enjoyed that one. All right, then I reread, I should say, the first book in the Prison Healer trilogy. It is called The Prison Healer, and it is by Lynette Noni. And I am preparing to read the entire trilogy. And so I wanted to go back to book 1 because I didn't really remember all the details. I just kind of high level, and I wanted to kind of steep myself in the details before I continued on in the trilogy. And basically the first book is about a young girl who lives in a prison, and she is the prison healer. And while she is there, this person comes into the prison, a woman, and she's so ill. And she has to be, she's basically required to take part in these challenges. And if she does that, she basically can't. She's just so sick. And so the healer kind of puts her hand up and says, I will do this on her behalf. And each of these challenges has to do with one of the elements, like air, fire, water. And she also has kind of these, almost like a backing from like this royal family. So there's like this element of that's kind of coming into the storyline. She has these allies, within the prison. They're kind of trying to help her with these challenges. And the thing I remember the most is there's this really fun twist at the end of book 1. And so I'm excited to dig into the next 2 books in this series. And then the last book that I read that took over my life for like the last part of January is Manacled. This is by Sen-Lin Yu, and Manacled is a fanfic. It is based on Harry Potter. It is kind of a mashup of Harry Potter and The Handmaid's Tale. And the basic plot is that Voldemort is basically winning the war. And it's kind of it starts after like the 5th year of Harry Potter. So like there's basically you can think of like the last few Harry Potter books like haven't taken place yet, basically, if you're familiar with the series. So it kind of inserts itself in the timeline, and then it changes the timeline, or changes the plot in terms of what's happening. And so basically there's a situation where Muggle-born characters like Hermione, and this is considered a Hermione fanfic, so it is about Draco and Hermione. Hermione is basically assigned to Draco as like a mistress, and in Handmaid's Tale fashion, like he is meant to like impregnate her. As you can imagine, that implies some level of trigger warning for this particular book. It does have depictions of sexual assault. The author is very good about explaining the trigger warnings and explaining what's happening when, and like she's very, I would say, very sensitive about kind of how these topics are coming up in the book. This was something I was a little bit nervous about because I wasn't sure kind of how graphic this was going to be and if I would want to continue. And I would say, like, for me, although it was somewhat disturbing, it was fine. Like, I was able to continue, and I felt like the author was very careful about how she kind of handled these particular kind of sensitive topics. I will also say, so this book is over 800 pages. It just took forever to get through. It was serialized originally, I think. And so part of it is just like the author building off, the previous section and like keeping people engaged. And I would say it's probably a little bit long. It reads like a first novel, because I think it is, this person's first novel. This book is actually going to be kind of like revised and traditionally published later on this year as a book called Alchemized. And so she's removing it from the Harry Potter world and like shifting it over to a different world building so that it can actually be traditionally published. Fanfic cannot be sold because it's someone else's, content. And so this is a book that's basically like people just pass it around. I mean, it's available online. You can download it, but it's basically like a Word document that you download and you can like read on your Kindle or other device. I will just say I will never look at Harry Potter the same way again. I was very deeply impacted by this book. I thought it was super interesting. It was so creative in terms of what this author did with someone else's kind of like world and content. I was very impressed by it. I didn't know what to expect. And because I don't want to go like too much into it, because there's a couple twists that are just like so wonderful to experience on your own. There's the first third of the book that you read, and it's kind of the Handmaid's Tale, plot. Then there's a shift in the second third of the book, roughly second third, where there's flashbacks. and it completely changes everything you know about the first third. And then you kind of continue on with the storyline in the last third of the book. And the twists are just deeply interesting, kept me turning the pages. Like, I did not have this on audio, and I read, you know, in a period of days, you know, like 800 plus pages. I was just like so invested in this. So I would highly recommend this. If you don't know anything about Harry Potter, you probably need to read Harry Potter first to understand like the depth with which this person has researched the world to incorporate it into Manacled. I think it would be hard to like really understand what was going on if you hadn't read Harry Potter. But if you are a Harry Potter fan, this is a great introduction to the fan fiction that is kind of surrounding that world. And I would definitely pick up Alchemized in the future and see what this person did with it. So those were the 25 books that I read in January of 2025. And I hope you will check back to see my February TBR pile and what I'm hoping to read in this next month. Until I see you in that video, happy reading.